really, really expensive pieces of loud, annoying furniture. So you have fewer because adults aren't stupid.
Yep.
You play that forward for 70 years, and we have had a population bust in the making, global in scope for decades now. And most of the advanced world has now aged past the point of no return. That includes countries like China. So in this coming decade, it's not just that we're going to see populations aging out of being competitive. We're going to see populations aging out of being sustainable and actually being countries. One of the many, many, many outcomes of the 2020s is the end of China as a unified nation state and as an economy. But this has all been hardwired in now for 40 years, and we are finally reaching the point where the page turns.
Yeah, Western countries and China and Russia and certainly Western Europe, I mean, you can't have a country if you don't have children. Yeah. So that is really going to rearrange the map. I mean, I think of especially like Japan, right? What will happen in 5 to 7 decades? I mean, will other countries just invade Japan's land because there's just no one there to protect it? I mean,
there's no one close by that has a demographic that's much better than Japan. So I'm not worried about that specific outcome for the Japanese.
Fair enough, but you don't need to have the country next to you in order to take it, right?
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Now, every country is going to have its own story because every country started aging at a different point, and they started aging at a different rate, and how you live in urban versus rural zones is dependent upon the local geography. So an example on the positive side, we started industrializing in the United States 200 years ago. So for us, this hasn't been a 40, 50-year process. This has been a 200-year process. And so our birth rate has dropped incrementally that entire time, but we've adapted to it as we've shifted into the cities. So the United States still today has the highest birth rate among any of the advanced worlds. We're the most slowly aging country. But if you go to a country like, say, China, that only started the industrialization process in about 1985, they crammed 200 years of economic advancement into 40 years. Yep. That also means they crammed 200 years of demographic adjustment into 40 years.
Tell us what that means. I mean, we all know about the one-child policy and so forth, but what do you mean when you say they crammed that into 40 years?
So one of the reasons why the Chinese have been so economically successful in many people's eyes is because they have done 200 years of industrial development, building out industrial plant and infrastructure and power lines in a single generation. Yep. In the United States, we did that very slowly over the generations. We didn't finish even electrifying the countryside until the 1960s.
Wow,
and so
that's amazing.
For us, we were able to adapt each step of this into our cultural evolution. That's one of the reasons why in the United States, you're far more likely to live in the suburbs than the urban cores, because we did this on a slow process and we can make adjustments and people can still have families of size in the suburbs. In the case of China, the population was already relatively high. And when they made the jump, they skipped all the intervening steps. They didn't have to develop telephones that were on landlines. They skipped right to cellular.
Right. Yep.
And in doing so, they went into denser and denser footprints very, very early in the process. So you went from a subsistence farm to a high-rise condo in a generation.
Right.
And when you're in a condo, no kids. So one child, is that part of it? Absolutely. Yep. But one child is the secondary factor in the Chinese demographic collapse. The single biggest one is that they all moved in small condos in a very short period of time, and everyone just stopped having kids altogether. Yeah. So we know now that China will cease to exist as a functional demographic structure and economy this decade, because it's not just that they ran out of children. That was 30 years ago. They're now running out of 30-somethings.
Yeah. Wow. That's something. One of the things I'm always saying to my listeners, Peter, is watch old movies, watch old TV shows, listen to old music, read old books. And I do that. I make it a real point to do that, even though a lot of those old movies really aren't that good, but I watch them just because I want to learn and get a take on what life was like back in, the 60s, the 50s, right? I'm not saying even really older, even remind me of what it was like in the 90s. I was there, but it's still a reminder. And one of the things that always strikes me, and I must admit, being single, I'm somewhat envious of, is I look at how life was in the 60s, the 70s, and there was this giant cohort of baby boomers, and it must have just been such a social life, and I'm in this tiny little crappy Gen X generation, and there's like nobody, right? And it was just interesting. Like, they all grew up together. They all did things together. All the TV shows reflected that. The whole culture just reflected their movement through the pipeline, if you will. And
part of the reason why the baby boomers think they're so important is because they have been, and they still are. I mean, in the late 60s to the early 80s, they were coming of age. They drove consumption. That's why we had inflation then. Yeah. In the 90s and into the 2000s, they had come out of their consumption phase. They were saving for retirement. That's why we had investment booms. Right. And now our inflation, it's because they're all retiring. And we have a large generation that's just going away. And next decade, we have to pay for that.
I don't want to forget to ask you about that. The video you just recorded the other day from Las Vegas, okay? You were holding probably your iPhone with a Luxor in the background. And you talked about how this is changing capital markets, changing inflation, and the whole structure of the economy. Can you elaborate on it? Tell the listeners what you think about that.
Yeah, sure. So historically, capital and demographics have not been intertwined. Now, yes, as you age, your net worth increases. And as you age, you become more adventurous with your investments, and that drives more economic activity. And then when you retire, you cash it all and go to T-bills because you won't be able to stomach any sort of market turning or currency turning. That's been true since the dawn of recorded history. There's nothing new there. What is new is the demographic profile has changed. So in a pre-industrial world, you had very few 60-somethings. You had more 50-somethings and yet more 40-somethings and on down. It built a pyramid. What industrialization and urbanization has done is change the shape of the pyramid. In some countries like the United States, it's more or less a chimney, but with a bulge for the baby boomers. Mm-hmm. In some like Germany, it's a diamond with more people in their 50s than their 40s than their 30s than their 20s, and then narrowing up as you would expect at the top. What's happening globally right now, not just with the American boomers, is that we've got this big cadre of people in their 60s who are moving into retirement, and they are a bulge in the structure. So instead of just a small group of people relative to the overpopulation that are moving on and changing their investment portfolios, we have the single largest generation in our history doing that. And on average, they will have completed that transition by the end of this year. So we go from having some of the richest, most liberal, most open, most liquid capital markets we've ever known to something that's a lot closer to the opposite in less than a year.
But, with our financial repression that we've been going through for many years, I mean, this system has pushed people way farther out onto the risk curve in terms of their financial lives. You can't be 70, 75 years old investing in bonds or T-bills anymore, right? It just doesn't work. So you see these older people doing things that they shouldn't be doing financially. They shouldn't have to do, I'll put it that way. But they've got to earn some yield, and they're
And the first time you have a market turning, they become destitute. Yeah, that's why most people don't do that. I agree that there's a percentage of people that are, and that is unfortunate. Right. And we're about to learn that good and hard, because we're not just having this demographic turning, we're of course at the market tightening at the same time, and that's just damnably inconvenient. Yeah,
but make sure we understand the link between inflation, capital availability, and the demographic situation. So baby boomers are retiring quickly. I mean, most of them are almost through the pipe. I don't know. I haven't looked lately, but
the midpoint is the end of this year.
Yeah, say that again?
The midpoint is the end of this year.
Okay, so the midpoint of the baby boomers is the end of this year now, and then it trails off. And I don't know the stats, but something like 10,000 a day retire, or some number like that, or whatever.
It's some ridiculous number.
It's big, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the problem here is we're losing the single largest worker cadre we've ever had, and the replacement generation down at the bottom of that pyramid, the Zoomers, they are the smallest generation we have ever had.
I'm sort of wondering why you identified, and you did that in the book, why you identified the Zoomers and you didn't say just the next one down, which is my cohort, which I think might be yours too, which is Gen X.
Well, Gen X and millennials have been in the labor market already. So we're already factored into the math. Now, there's pros and there's cons, and that shapes a lot of things, but we are already in. The Zoomers are the ones who are coming in to replace the boomers. Okay. And we have our largest generation going out. our smallest generation coming in. So right now, annually, that's 400,000 worker shortage. And that will increase every year until 2034, when it'll peak at 900,000 shortage.
Okay, so
and these people are already born. They're already on the way. We know exactly what's going to happen to the net flows each and every year moving forward.
Yeah, there's no mystery about this, which is what I love about studying demography. And Harry Dent got me into that in the 90s. And ever since, I've been a real, student of that idea, even though some of his predictions have been a little off. So he's been on the show 11 times, and every time there's a bubble, but this time he's going to be right. I think we'll see. But what that does, what you just said, is that gives the bargaining power to the labor, not the capital, right?
The problem is that capital is going away at the same time. I certainly agree that the relationships are going to change. I think it's a little bit arrogant to think that I know exactly how. Yeah. But we're definitely entering a period of protracted and extended and increasing labor shortage. At the same time, we're entering into a period of protracted and extended and increasing capital shortage. Okay. And just to make it a little bit more fun, China's collapsing against this backdrop. So even if we decided we were fine with a completely globalized supply chain, we still need to double the size of the industrial plant in the next few years with less capital and with less labor. Okay.
So less labor would be inflationary, because that would push wages up generally.
I would argue that at the moment, the labor disconnect is the single largest issue behind our inflation numbers right now.
Okay. But tell me about less capital. I mean, I'm coming at it from kind of this angle that, capital doesn't really disappear. It changes hands. And, you could argue it changes places, right? It might be in more, risk-on investments like the stock market, or it might be risk-off like bonds or, money markets, right? So what do you mean that the capital is drying up? Like, how explain that a little more?
Well, the baby boomers are at the height of their earning experience. And as of the end of this year, they won't be earning anymore. So the net inflows into the system from just normal demographic structure dry up considerably. The next generation down, Gen X, is very small. And even if we do succeed in having significant raises now in this labor inflationary environment, there aren't enough of us to generate nearly as much in total. So step one, we're losing volume. Step two, we're losing investment quality, because in the flight from risk on to risk off, the capital becomes a lot less interesting. Sure, this is going to be broadly decent for people who want to be in the government and borrow, because that's the T-bill. That's considered the ultimate gold standard. And to a degree, that helps with the mortgage market as well, because mortgage rates primarily draw their guidance from the 10-year as opposed to interest rate levels. After that, though, you're entirely dependent on capital flight from the rest of the world. Now, I think that'll be robust, but I also think that'll be wildly inconsistent depending on what's going on in the United States versus wherever else the capital might be. This is still the deepest, most liquid market in the world. It's denominated in the sole source of global store of value. It is the only meaningful method of exchange for international transport and trade. And the Japanese and the Europeans have basically signed on to a US dollar denominated system as part of the deal that generated the sanctions against the Russian central bank a couple of months ago. So if you're going to benefit from this in any way, the US dollar is the place to be, but you can't predict the inflows year on year of what's coming in from the European space or the Asian space. It will come when they're in trouble and we look good, and it will probably never go back. And so we know that the capital supply has to drop domestically, and we know we're going to get these bursts of capital from abroad. But planning on that, that takes a smarter brain than I have.
So 15 years away, though, that capital starts to pass from baby boomers to millennials.
Yes.
What happens?
And the millennials themselves will then be entering their late stage worker years. Well, they will gradually become the dominant capital providing class again. So for the United States, we have a pretty big needle to pass through here. And a roughly 10 to 20 years, it can be a little loosey-goosey based on what happens with the monetary system and the Fed in that time. But in that decade of time, the United States will go back to having what we would consider a more stable capital structure. And at the same time, when you get into the 2040s, the labor market will start reconstituting based on normal demographic factors, because the millennials' kids will then be entering the workforce. We'll be through this long winter of the Zoomers. But no one else gets to do that. Everyone else went through industrialization and urbanization either faster or more intensely than the United States did. A couple exceptions, but only a couple. And so for them, they're looking at labor markets getting smaller every year and the capital supply getting smaller every year. And still in this decade, their advanced worker cadre, that big, giant last generation, moves into retirement. So their need for government spending to keep those people alive skyrockets and never drops.
And that is very problematic for places like China, Japan, Russia, et cetera. Yeah,
I don't think China's going to survive long enough to have to wrestle with that problem, but for Japan, certainly.
Yeah, I know. That's interesting you say that, because I have never been one of these believers that China's taking over the world. I remember the kind of xenophobia that was going on with Japan was going to take over the world, and that never happened, clearly. China's got 10 years. And then it all starts to really shift, as I see it.
I think it'll be over 10 years from now.
Yeah, you really
think we're going through the shift right now.
Tell me what you mean by that. I mean, is it going to be an overthrow? I know the Chinese Communist government is very sensitive to civil unrest, right? They have huge sensitivity to that over there, and as probably they should.
Because that's how they got into power, yes.
Yeah, so what happens with China? Like, how does that unfold?
We've got some mid and long-term trends, and then there's a couple of really acute ones that are going on right now. Let's first deal with the longer-term ones. Finance doesn't work in China the way it does here. The Chinese will throw a bottomless supply of capital against anything in order to make sure that people have jobs. It doesn't matter if there's a product on the back end, really, as long as the people are working. So everything that people say about the U.S. Fed is actually true to an order of magnitude higher in China. Yeah. So the U.S. dollar is the global currency. It's the medium of exchange. It's the store of value. It's the lubricant for the number one economy and 2/3 of the top 20. The yuan is used just in China. It's not internationally traded, and they regularly expand their money supply by 5 times as much as we do. And at most times in the last 10 years, the yuan supply has been twice that of the US dollar, even though it's just not exchanged at all. So their financial system is its own thing. And to think that this is going to continue in perpetuity is being really creative with your math. They get their energy from a continental way. They don't have a navy that's capable of making that far in force in order to secure their own supply lines. Yep. So China is the country most dependent upon the U.S. Navy to keep the lights on. In manufacturing, their demographics have aged so much already that China is no longer the low-cost producer for any manufactured product. There is not a product that the Chinese make that cannot be made in North America at a lower price point. Now, you have to build the industrial plant first. So I don't mean to suggest we can flip a switch and it's all here tomorrow. Right. But it does mean that anytime there's a hiccup in the Chinese system for any reason and somebody relocates, they never go back. Because it's better with a shorter supply chain, with less energy, with less transport, with more efficient labor closer to home. There's not a sector where that doesn't work. And then in terms of industrial commodities, kind of an echo of what's going on with energy markets, they have to get it from half a world away. They can't go at it and get it themselves. They are completely dependent upon the globalized system as enforced by the American Navy. So any of these issues by themselves are country killers, independent of the demographic situation. Right. And in the short term, I think we're seeing the whole system go belly up. I think it's safe to assume that most people have relatively formed opinions about whether the COVID vaccine is the way to go or natural immunity is the way to go. But I think if we're all really being honest with ourselves, we will admit that people on the other side of that divide have some relevant points that are worth discussing. Yeah, sure. And we certainly know that if you have both, you're in better shape. Yep. Neither of those are options in China. The Chinese vaccine doesn't work versus the Omicron variant, certainly not Omicron B. And because, in many ways, that the Chinese government was so successful at keeping COVID out these past 2 years, no one in China has natural immunity. So if they were to open up with Omicron B being the dominant strain, Omicron B is the most communicable virus we've ever faced, and it's the highest lethality rate of all of the COVID variants to date. If they just opened up, they'd have millions of deaths a month for at least 3 months. And in a one-man show government, that is how you bring the system down. So COVID lockdowns that affect entire cities, this is their only option for the foreseeable future. So Shanghai shut down on April 1. They reopened on June 1. They're in the process of locking down again already because Omicron is just so communicable. Masks don't stop it sufficiently. What is China if it's not a manufacturing center?
Yeah.
Because that's all they have left. And now that is leaving very, very quickly. I think Apple's the best example there. Apple is the American company that has ignored the writing on the wall the most. And every time there's been a health issue with COVID or a trade war with Trump or Bernie Sanders coming out and beating the trade drum, every time something has happened, an explosion of genocide in Xinjiang, the crackdowns in Hong Kong, they've ignored it and they've doubled down. Mm-hmm. So they are the American company most committed to China. Over 90% of their supply chains within China now. And as of last month, even they started looking for alternatives. Everyone is on their way out because China is no longer a reliable manufacturing partner.
Is Africa the next big labor market to exploit for cheap labor? I know China's got a lot of dealings in Africa, but it's so disjointed. And
first of all, China does not have many dealings in Africa. They have some infrastructure that they've built.
Yeah, and they're they're doing a lot of loans there.
Well, whenever you see the Chinese spending $12 billion on something that's only worth $3 or $4 billion, that's not investment. That's capital flight. That's some bureaucrat taking advantage of that hyper-financialized system to get some out. So when it's his time to run for the door, he already has a nest egg.
Oh, that's interesting, because the impression I got was they were trying to act like a World Bank, where
they're splashing around a lot of cash. I agree. I'm just saying that it's not in anything that would broadly be considered sound investment. Okay. Most of the infrastructure is not in places that are really of any use. I mean, if the Chinese build infrastructure in a place that hasn't had infrastructure for the last 70 years, you really got to ask yourself why there has not been infrastructure there for the last 70 years.
Someone would have done it by now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, they are investing in some resource production zones, absolutely, but again, they're overpaying for them. Mm-hmm. So the Chinese are doing no refining, and they're doing no manufacturing in Africa. So they're actually not taking the African labor force and bringing it up a notch at all. And if they want unskilled labor, they've got that closer to home in a place like, say, Cambodia. So for Africa to kind of move up the ladder, they've got to be part of someone else's supply chain. They don't have the indigenous capacity, technology, and capital necessary to do it all by themselves. And in a world that's moving into a tighter labor market, if you're not going to relocate the labor, you're talking about using some degree of automation to help out. Yeah. Some places can do that, some places can't. But it's difficult for me to see kind of a neo-colonial manufacturing system set up to tap unskilled labor on a different continent, especially a continent that has as riven geographically as Africa. So the basic transport issues are very, very difficult. It would be cheaper to do more automation in a closer economy. So in the case of Germany, that's probably going to be Poland. In the case of the United States, that's probably going to be Mexico and Colombia. In the case of China, that would probably be Southeast Asia.
That's actually, I was going to ask you about automation a moment ago. There's certainly a lot of fear that automation is going to take a lot of jobs away, especially in transportation, which is really one of the biggest industries in the world when you count all the taxis, trucks, and everything, the tankers with, self-driving tankers and cargo ships and everything else, right? Peter, I'm sure you've laughed at this stat too, but according to the BLS, the only actual job category that was ever lost to automation is elevator operator. So,
technically that wasn't automated. We just do it ourselves now.
Yeah, right. It's DIY. You push your own button nowadays. But are we at a point where automation now is different than it's been in the past? Because it always ultimately created more jobs in the past. And it is different, and probably not in the way that most people are thinking. I'm not overly concerned about automation being a giant job destroyer. Mm-hmm. Remember, the Zoomers are the ones who are coming in. Small
smallest generation we've ever had, and they're not millennials, they're not social, they're antisocial, and they're very loyal workers. They're very nervous people because they were raised by Gen X to be told that the future was a dark place where you will have no power, because that's what it has been for us to this point. And because of that, they're very loyal workers. Once they get a job, they cling on to it like their life depends upon it. But they're antisocial. They want to work remotely, preferably in a closet, preferably coding. These are not line jobs. These are not public service jobs. This is a very specific subset. So, if you're in San Diego in San Jose and you need a bunch of coders, great. Your workforce is covered for the next 20 years. You need them for anything else? Yikes. So we are going to need automation, not just because we have fewer workers, but because the workforce of those fewer workers is very, very different from what we have had for the last 40 years. So we have to have it. On the flip side, automation is one of the most expensive things you can do. It's expensive to develop, to operationalize, to install, and people always forget about this step, the most expensive of all, to keep it updated. That takes capital. We're not going to have as much of that. So this wrestling over what little bits of capital are left is going to be huge.
Okay, so in other words, you're saying that will slow automation.
I would expect it to, yes. The places that can do it successfully or most successfully are going to be those places that do have a stronger capital base like the United States. I would also add in that in a world that deglobalizes, the idea of having a supply chain with 1,000 steps is kind of silly and honestly really dangerous. Yeah. So you need shorter supply chains closer to the end consumer. I
think COVID made us all realize that.
Absolutely. I agree, but compared to what COVID has done, what's coming is a whole nother level in terms of intensity.
Tell us about that. Well, when you're finished. But
sure. So manufacturing, especially for things like electronics, it does best. It's most efficient when it can tap different wage levels and skill levels. So you do the low-skilled stuff in one place and the high-skilled stuff in one place. And for the last 25 years, that has made China very successful. They do the assembly, they do the low end, and they do it at scale. So they can then have the intermediate and the higher end parts elsewhere in East Asia or maybe even in North America. And there's a lot of back and forth, and the average manufactured product crosses a border at least 100 times. Even in automotive in the United States, if you're taking each individual piece, you're talking like 25,000, maybe 30,000 border crossings. It's massive.
Oh my gosh.
In the world we're moving to, that's going to be harder to do. But the United States has Mexico. So we've got 130 million Mexicans, 35 million northern Mexicans very proximate to the border, and we can still play in that old style manufacturing. At the same time, we have the best capital structure to bits and pieces moving into the new style. And the consumer base is right here, both in the United States and Mexico. So having that everything proximate and co-located, that's going to be kind of the big mix of factors that generate outsized success. You're not going to have that in Asia, because the consumption base is gone and the labor structure is now too expensive. And if you break down maritime transport safety, those border crossings are more difficult, because in the United States, it's a land border with a country we broadly trust. In East Asia, almost all of it is by sea, and the Chinese are making a point of being a bag of dicks at sea. So the very concept that you can have a maritime trading system in a country where China is either rising or falling is a bit of a reach.
So bad for China again.
Very.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Going back to what we talked about at the beginning, you didn't say it, but you were talking about the Bretton Woods system, right? That happened right before the end of World War II and put the U.S. in this really enviable position with reserve currency and so forth. And somehow it lasted post Nixon's closing the gold window in 1971. And I'm wondering, that was a good deal for the U.S. Was that also, all things considered, the U.S. being the world's maritime policeman, was that a good deal for the rest of the world?
Oh, yeah. For everyone who participated in globalization, it would have been like they and they alone had won World War II.
Yeah.
They had access to a world full of resources and markets in a way that only the Brits could have even dreamed of doing for the previous 300 years. And now it was available for everybody. So the only countries that, for whatever reason, didn't like that system were the countries that wanted all of the benefits and none of the cost. So countries that sided against the United States in the Cold War.
Mm-hmm. And then you lay on top of that the Marshall Plan. And, the U.S. is a pretty good global citizen, if you ask me. Am I
we
right
have
about
our
that?
moments.
Yeah. I mean, that's.
I don't want to suggest for a heartbeat that we did this because we were nice.
Yeah.
We found a way to stave off nuclear war and get a bunch of allies to side with us, even in the worst case scenario. That's why we did it. The fact that it made the whole world wealthy was a happy side effect from our point of view. From everyone else's point of view, that was the reason to join.
Yeah. But, and I mean, for all the U.S. bashers, it's just kind of interesting to me. One of the sayings I constantly say here on the show is you can't hear the dogs that don't bark, right? And the dog that doesn't bark is the one you're alluding to. The whole world would have just been much poorer had that globalization and global trade not occurred, right?
Well, I mean, playing historical what ifs is kind of a fun thing.
Sure.
It's always guesswork, but World War II probably wouldn't have ended. It would have just continued on with the with the Allies then splitting apart with the Soviets on one side and the West on the other. And keep in mind that in the dying days of World War II, we dropped a couple A-bombs. So I think you have an idea of what that field of competition might have looked like. Yeah,
right. Yeah, certainly. Well, it's interesting to watch that series on Amazon Prime, Man in the High Tower. Is that what it's called? But, what might have happened, right? Yeah, very interesting. Peter, what else do you want us to know? The book it just covers so much, and it's excellent, by the way. What else do you want to say to our listeners and let us know about any component?
Sure. So since this is an investment show, I think the best way to do is to talk about a chapter that you haven't made it to yet. There's an industrial commodities chapter. So anything that goes into anything that's not energy and food. The Industrial Revolution did more than just introduce us to what we now consider to be electricity and manufacturing. It also took the lessons of the Renaissance and applied them at scale, first through the Germans and the Brits, and then eventually for the rest of the world. And we figured out all these components and elements that make up our world, and we figured out how to purify them and then recombine them in ways we found useful. What we have missed in the discussion of modern globalization and economic integration is their role. Because the very core of globalization is anyone can go anywhere to get anything. And when we talk about the breakdown of supply chains, we're thinking of semiconductors and tires and widgets, and that's true, but that's not the whole story. We're entering into a world where the raw commodity access that then goes into the processed material, that then goes into the intermediate products, that goes into the finished products, that very base first step, that is no longer guaranteed. So we can look forward to large portions of the world losing access to the inputs that are necessary to attempt a modern lifestyle. Wow. And if you want to talk about the sexiest of all of them, silicon, not for panels, silicon for semiconductors, because 95% of it comes from one mine in North Carolina.
Wow.
So it's one thing to control global food or global energy. Yeah. It's another thing when you can control the only input that allows digitization to even theoretically happen. And the United States is going to have to figure out what to do with that over the next decade.
Well, why are we going to have to figure out what to do with that? We're going to continue to mine and extract materials,
but will we sell it to everyone?
Oh,
we're entering into a world where there's not enough energy and there's not enough food.
Right.
And where we're going to prioritize our own manufacturing. These are all strategic choices that we're going to make either by choice or failure to make one. When you get to semiconductors, though, when it's all coming from one place, that's an entirely other level. Because if you can't get enough energy, yes, your car stops. Yes, the lights go out. This is bad. But if you can't get any microchips, you can't even pretend to catch up in any sector at all.
Yeah. Well, that's why countries like Russia shouldn't do what they do.
The Russians have a very different definition for what modern quality of life means. That is one of their biggest negatives. That's one of their biggest strengths. It all depends upon how you're measuring it and what it is they're trying to do at the time.
Yeah. So what's the investment? I mean, what do you think's coming next in the economy? We alluded to that, of course, with the capital drying up and the worker shortage continuing and so forth. But just give us like the what do we do with that?
Well,
information.
I'm not a CFA, so let me just start with that.
It's okay. Neither am I.
Let me rephrase that. Investing is not my world. I can tell you, though, that we are looking at chronic shortages in a lot of base materials that make up our world, not just the industrial commodities I just kind of went through, but food. The world's top wheat exporter has invaded the world's number 4 wheat exporter, and the world's top wheat exporter also is the world's largest exporter of fertilizer and the components necessary so people can make their own fertilizer. Yeah. So we're in the early ages of a multi-year shortage in all things agricultural. Russia's also a big player in the aluminum market. Or it was, not anymore. They're also big in copper. That hasn't gone to zero yet. It's on its way down. Platinum group materials, for example, especially palladium, which does double time with silicon and semiconductors. The problem, as you're looking at all of these, however, is that sourcing is critical. One of the biggest disservices, in my opinion, that the financial sector has done for us all over the last 20 years is become used to this environment where capital is flush and liquid and we can invest in everything and we don't have to be all that discerning. Right. Because if the money is free, why the hell not? Mm-hmm. Well, the money's not free anymore. And so the financial sector has to actually provide value add. In the old system, the entire developing world was in one exchange traded fund. That's asinine to think that India and Brazil and China and Russia have anything in common aside from size. Their markets are completely different. The sectors they play in are completely different. Investing in them is completely different. And yet there they are all together. Same with frontier markets, which makes even less sense. Mm-hmm. Like what in the world do Argentina and Vietnam have in common? Yeah. Nothing. We have to disaggregate all that now. Okay. And that goes not just for the markets in general, but for the specific products. So, for example, if you want to invest in agricultural processing, that seems like a big business right now. It's probably going to get bigger. But all the major agricultural processes that operate in the economies that are not getting hit by these shortages, think France, Canada, Australia, the United States, they're also in Russia and Ukraine. So you really have to do your homework to carve out the parts of the world from your investment choices that just aren't playing anymore. And that means you have to remove companies that have been household names. I'm thinking just Bunge here to pick one out of the air. That is not inappropriate if you want to take advantage of this boom we're going to see in demand for those products in an era of scarcity.
Mm-hmm. How about building materials?
That's messy because a lot of them are closer to home. Overall, I think that's a great idea, but you have to be really, really careful of what the sourcing is and where the companies that are producing that material are selling into. So, for example, if you're selling into the United States, particularly in the Mountain West, the Southwest, or the South, that is where the boom in the United States is going to be in residential real estate for at least the next 15 years. People are moving there because it's warmer. That's the boomers. People are moving there because it's cheaper. That's the millennials having families. And nobody wants to be on a metro where they might get COVID again. Yeah, so, everyone's moving into that kind of arc. Mm-hmm. That's, as a rule, not how we decide where we get the stuff that goes into it. You either have local companies that are not publicly traded, or you have international ones that are like bringing in wood from Canada. And untangling that mess requires a brain that's bigger than mine.
Mm-hmm. It's hard to tell from what you said as we started when we talked, and it's been a bit of a theme on this interview of the worker shortage, which would be inflationary pressure, and the capital shortage or the capital contraction from risk assets, at least. I mean, the capital still exists, would be deflationary. Is the future inflationary or deflationary?
For the United States, for at least the next 5 years, strongly inflationary. If we make some policy mistakes, it could be stagflationary. But I think a more likely outcome is high growth, high inflation. So think about something that's a little bit more reminiscent of the 60s and the early 70s than the late 70s. We need to double the size of the industrial plant. We need at least 4 million new homes. We're a magnet for migrants, skilled and unskilled. We're dealing with a massive retooling of the existing industrial base, all at the same time that we're having the Ukraine war. So avoiding inflation is impossible. Avoiding high inflation is probably impossible, but at least we're going to have the growth to go along with it.
Yeah. Very interesting, Peter. Well, it's always a pleasure. You've been on the show several times now, and I always love talking with you. Wish we could do it for longer. The book is out, and all your other books are in all